last thing that we were talking about was synaptic transmission, and we were learning about the ways that we stimulate neurotransmitter release, and we got to learn all those wonderful 7 steps which are illustrated here on this page. And we learned that there were 2 different types of neurotransmitters. What we call excitatory, which means that they're going to cause a depolarization in the new neuron. Okay? And then there were inhibitory, which cause a hyperpolarization in the new neuron. Okay? What we call the postsynaptic neuron. And so that's why we call them inhibitory postsynaptic potentials and excitatory postsynaptic potentials, or IPSP and EPSP for short. Last thing I want to talk about here is what a neurotransmitter really is. And we'll get into these a little bit in greater detail in our last lecture of this unit. But today we're just going to kind of explain what they are and talk about a few of them. A neurotransmitter is essentially any signaling molecule released by a neuron. Some will bind to the receptors and act quickly to open or close ion channels in the membrane. Others act more slowly, working by way of a second messenger system, influencing chemical reactions inside the cell. We won't talk about second messenger systems really in this unit at all, but we will talk about them because your hormones, also some of your hormones work by a second messenger system, and some of your special senses utilize a second messenger system. So we'll look at those in our next unit. Result of either process can be excitation or inhibition of postsynaptic neurons, like I was just talking about. And to satisfy, or to be classified as a neurotransmitter, it must satisfy these following criteria. Must elicit the appropriate response when introduced in the synaptic cleft, which means that they must bind to the specific receptors that they're going to target. They're going to be occurring naturally in the presynaptic neuron and are only going to be released at the right time when that presynaptic neuron is stimulated. Okay, so they aren't just being released willy-nilly. There's a specific time and coordinated manner, and it has everything to do with when the action potential reaches that synaptic neuron. Okay. A lot of drugs affect neurotransmitter release and the binding of neurotransmitters to various things. Okay, and so various, over-the-counter drugs, as in like pharmaceutical drugs, as well as, the illicit illegal drugs, like cocaine and marijuana and that kind of stuff. We don't really get into that, but if you take psychology or even a class, like drug psychology, drugs and behavior, that kind of stuff, you would learn a lot more about that stuff. It's really interesting, neat stuff, but we just don't really have enough time to get into it in this class. As far as we are concerned, the most common and most prevalent, I guess that's the same thing, but the one that we talk about the most is acetylcholine. This is used between neurons outside the central nervous system, as well as what we call the neuromuscular junction. A neuromuscular junction is the point where a neuron meets a muscle, so where nerves are innervating muscles. Without the release of acetylcholine, muscles will not contract. So that's why I kind of like to go out of the order of the book, because we are learning about action potentials and the release of acetylcholine. And then later, we'll talk about what happens when acetylcholine binds to receptors on a muscle cell membrane. Okay. Acetylcholine is the excitatory neurotransmitter at some synapses. It's inhibitory at others. Any synapse that uses acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter is called a cholinergic synapse, which is nice because choline is in acetylcholine and cholinergic. So that's kind of where that name comes from. The next 2 are called the catecholamines. And there's a third, which is dopamine. But the 2 primary ones that we talk about in this class are epi and norepi. Abbreviated as NE for norepinephrine is what you'll see a lot of times. And epi is either E or just epi. The other name for those are adrenaline, noradrenaline. Noradrenaline for norepinephrine, adrenaline for epinephrine. You've probably heard a million times the word adrenaline in your life. It's that drug, or not drug, but that chemical that causes us to really get jacked up It's what we release in those fight or flight situations. We also release a lot of norepinephrine. As far as their role as a neurotransmitter, they play roles in arousal, dreaming, and regulating mood. Small number of neurons in the brain use epinephrine as a neurotransmitter. Both norepinephrine and epinephrine also are hormones. Okay, they're released by the adrenal medulla, which is part of the adrenal gland, and they're released into the blood. So when they're released into the blood by the adrenal medulla, they're considered a hormone. When they're released by a neuron, they're a neurotransmitter. It's the same chemical, it's just classified as a neurotransmitter when a neuron releases it versus a hormone when a gland releases it. Okay. Brain neurons containing neurotransmitter dopamine are active during emotional responses, addictive behaviors, and pleasurable experiences. They say dopamine is kind of your feel-good chemical. Okay. Dopamine-releasing neurons also help regulate skeletal muscle tone and some aspects of muscle contraction movements. I'm sure you've all probably heard of Parkinson's disease, autoimmune disease that causes muscle stiffness due to degeneration neurons that release it. Okay, anybody know or ever seen anybody with Parkinson's before? Okay, ever heard of Michael J. Fox? That's pretty young, but maybe you've seen like Back to the Future, Teen Wolf, fantastic movie by the way. Sort of Back to the Future movies. Those are probably even before my time, but late 80s, early 90s. He was a child actor, really successful one. He grew up and was on several different TV shows and movies. His career basically got derailed by being diagnosed with this disease. It's an unfortunate disease because you really just can't relax your muscles. You have very little control, and so constantly they're moving, and you can't just do simple things like writing your name is difficult for somebody with Parkinson's. Buttoning T-shirts, that kind of, or button-up shirts. There's a lot of research out there, but it's really pretty just manageable situation. It's not a cure. Actually, medical marijuana is something that is being utilized and seems to be showing pretty good results with. So that's something that maybe in the future more states will utilize because of the number of people that really could benefit from it. I'm not going to get into that. Synapses using catecholamine as a neurotransmitter are called adrenergic synapses. We find these at the junctions between nerves and smooth muscles in the internal organs, as well as nerve-to-nerve junctions in our brain. As previously mentioned, neurotransmitters are stored in synaptic vesicles within the synaptic knob. These vesicles are docked to proteins, keeping them close to the presynaptic membrane for quick release. Two familiar and potentially deadly illnesses result from interference with this vesicle docking and fusion with the plasma membrane. I'm sure you've all heard of a tetanus shot before. You get a tetanus shot when you step on something like rusty, like a nail. You're trying to prevent tetanus toxin from doing what it does. Tetanus toxin prevents the release of neurotransmitters from inhibitory neurons in the spinal cord, which causes uncontrollable muscle contraction. A lot of times what they call lockjaw occurs because of this. Your muscles get kind of stuck in what they call tetany, where they're basically stuck in contraction. And so they can't relax. Botulinum toxin prevents the release of neurotransmitters from motor neurons, resulting in muscle weakness and paralysis. Anybody ever heard of Botox before? Okay, what do people get Botox for? Try to get rid of wrinkles in their face, right? Okay, they're injecting this toxin into their muscles in their face, so they're literally paralyzing the muscles in their face. It's temporary paralysis. Have you ever heard of botulism? Okay, you get that from improperly canned food, so don't get the canned goods that got dents in them and that kind of stuff because they could be compromised. Botulism is associated with botulinum toxin. Okay. It didn't show it here a couple slides ago where these synaptic vesicles were inside the knob, but there are proteins that kind of hold them in place. They're called docking proteins. When that calcium comes in, it basically releases them from the docking proteins to allow those synaptic vesicles to go to that presynaptic membrane, and those two toxins would prevent that from happening. Okay. and thus would not allow for neurotransmitters to be released. Any questions on
I just